"Mom, did you enjoy the $620,000 I gave you?" my son asked, smiling like he had just told me something obvious, something I should have been grateful for. And for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him, because $620,000 was not the kind of number that belonged in my life. Not in my small kitchen with its worn cabinets and the hum of an old refrigerator that I kept meaning to replace, but never could justify. So I just looked at him and said the only thing that made sense to me. "What? Money?" And that was the moment everything began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but like something deep under the surface cracking open, because Daniel's smile didn't disappear right away. It just froze, like he was waiting for me to laugh or correct myself. And when I didn't, when I just stood there holding a dish towel in my hands, he glanced over at Jessica, his wife. And that was the first time I noticed it. The way her expression tightened for just a second before she looked down at her phone, like none of this concerned her, like this was just a small misunderstanding that would sort itself out. But it didn't feel small to me. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet, because for the past 2 years I had been counting every dollar, choosing between refilling my prescriptions and fixing the heater during the winter, wearing the same coat through seasons that seemed to get colder each year, telling myself that Daniel was busy, that success had its demands, that this distance between us was just part of life. And yet here he was, standing in my kitchen talking about $620,000 like it had been sitting in my account this whole time, like I had somehow forgotten about it, which made no sense at all. And I could feel my heart beating a little faster, not from excitement, but from something quieter, sharper, a kind of confusion that started to arrange itself into questions I didn't yet know how to ask, because Daniel began explaining, talking about selling the house, about making sure I was taken care of, about setting everything up so I wouldn't have to worry anymore, his words coming out too quickly, too smoothly, like he had rehearsed them, while Jessica remained silent beside him, scrolling, tapping, avoiding eye contact. And I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't something they had just decided to tell me today. This had been decided long before they walked through my door with their suitcases and their polite smiles and their careful explanations about needing a place to stay just for a little while. And I remembered how I had stepped aside to let them in, how I had told myself that family takes care of each other, that this was temporary, that things would go back to normal soon. But standing there now, listening to my son talk about money I had never seen, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not panic, not anger, just a quiet certainty that something had gone very wrong, and that if I wanted to understand it, I would have to start looking much more carefully at everything they had said and everything they hadn't. I did not argue with him that afternoon. I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone of anything, because something in me had already decided that whatever the truth was, it would not come from what they were willing to tell me. So I simply nodded and said I must have forgotten, even though I knew that was impossible. And I watched the relief pass over Daniel's face like a shadow lifting, while Jessica finally looked up and offered a small smile that did not reach her eyes. And that was when I understood that silence, for now, would serve me better than questions, because questions can be answered with lies, but silence makes people reveal themselves without realizing it. And over the next few days, I began to notice things I had not paid attention to before, small details that did not belong in the story they were trying to tell me, like the way Jessica always carried her phone with her, even from room to room, like she was afraid to leave it unattended, or how Daniel avoided mentioning anything specific about the sale of the house, speaking in general terms, vague explanations that sounded reasonable until you listened closely and realized they did not actually explain anything at all. And meanwhile, my life continued exactly as it had before they arrived, which made his words about taking care of me feel even more distant from reality. Because I still woke up early to check the thermostat and decide whether I could afford to turn the heat up another degree, I still stood in the grocery store comparing prices down to the last dollar, putting things back on the shelf when the total in my head went too high. I still split my medication doses some weeks to make them last longer, telling myself it was temporary, always temporary. And yet, according to my son, I had been given more money than I had ever seen in my entire life. Enough to change everything. Enough to make all of those small daily calculations unnecessary. And that contradiction sat quietly in the back of my mind, growing heavier each time I thought about it, until it became impossible to ignore, because if that money truly existed, then it had gone somewhere. And if it had gone somewhere, then someone knew exactly where it was, and that meant this was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision, a series of decisions made without me, about me, and for the first time in a long while. I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not even anger, but a kind of clarity, like a window being wiped clean after years of dust, and I realized that the version of my life I had been accepting, the quiet struggle, the careful budgeting, the distance from my own son, might not have been the full truth after all. So the next morning, instead of going through my usual routine, I gathered my old documents, the ones I kept in a small box at the back of my closet, bank statements, identification, anything with my name on it. And I sat at the kitchen table for a long moment before standing up and reaching for my coat. Because if there was money with my name attached to it, I was going to find it, and I was not going to ask permission to do so. I chose a bank 10 miles away instead of the one Daniel used, not because it was more convenient, but because it was not familiar to them. And as I drove there that morning, I kept replaying his words in my mind, the confidence in his voice, the certainty that I had received something I had never seen, and I realized that whatever I was about to find, it would not be simple, because simple things do not require silence, and they do not come with careful glances between husband and wife, the kind I had started to recognize in my own kitchen. So when I walked into the bank, I took a moment to steady myself before approaching the counter, aware of how out of place I might look. An older woman holding a folder of old documents like she was trying to piece together a life that no longer made sense, and the young man who greeted me had the kind of polite smile that people use when they are not sure what you need yet, but are prepared to help. And I explained as calmly as I could that I needed to review any accounts associated with my name, that I believed there might be something I was not aware of. And as he typed into his computer, I watched his expression change, not dramatically, just a slight pause, a second longer than expected, before he asked if I could take a seat while he pulled up additional information, and that was when I felt it again, that quiet confirmation that I had been right to come, because people do not hesitate like that unless there is something to find. And when he returned a few minutes later with a woman who introduced herself as a manager, her tone was professional but careful, like she understood that whatever she was about to say might not be easy to hear, and she asked me to verify my identification, which I did, my hands steady, even though my thoughts were moving faster now, connecting pieces I had not fully understood before. And then she turned the screen slightly toward me and pointed to an account, my name clearly printed at the top, along with a balance that made my breath catch for just a moment, not because it was large, but because it was not what it should have been, because if what Daniel said was true, there should have been more, much more, and yet the numbers in front of me told a different story, one of transactions, transfers, movements of money that had already happened, and I asked the question as simply as I could. When had this account been opened? Who had access to it? And as she explained that it had been established under my name, but with authorized changes made shortly after, changes to contact information, to linked accounts, to access permissions, I listened without interrupting, even as a pattern began to form in my mind, one that did not require raised voices or accusations to understand, because every change she described pointed in the same direction, towards someone who had not only known about this money, but had taken deliberate steps to control it. And when I asked who had initiated those changes, she hesitated just slightly before explaining that she would need to review the authorization records in more detail, but that the updates had been submitted through verified channels, and I thanked her, because I had heard enough for now, enough to know that the truth was no longer a question of whether something had happened, but how much had been hidden. And as I walked back to my car, the morning felt different than it had just an hour before, not heavier, not darker, just clearer, like the world had shifted into focus. And for the first time since Daniel stood in my kitchen and spoke about money I had never seen, I understood that I was not dealing with confusion or forgetfulness. I was dealing with something intentional, something planned, and that meant I would need to be just as deliberate in what I did next. When I got back home, I did not go straight inside. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine off and the folder still resting on my lap, staring through the windshield at a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed on the outside, but because I now knew something inside it had been quietly unfolding without me. And I took a slow breath before stepping out, reminding myself that nothing about my routine needed to change. Not yet, because whatever had been done had been done under the assumption that I would never look closely, and that assumption was now my advantage. So when I opened the front door and heard Jessica's voice from the living room, light and casual, as if nothing in the world was wrong, I answered in the same tone, placing my coat on the hook and setting my folder down where it would not draw attention, and I moved through the kitchen the way I always did, filling the kettle, rinsing a cup, letting the familiar sounds settle around me. Because normalcy, I realized, was something I could use. It kept them comfortable. It kept them unguarded. And as Daniel walked in a few minutes later, asking how my morning had been, I simply said it was quiet, which was not untrue. It had been quiet in the way that important things often are, unfolding without noise, and I watched him nod, satisfied with that answer. While Jessica barely looked up from her phone, but I noticed the way her fingers paused for just a second when I mentioned I had been out. A small detail that might have meant nothing before, but now it stood out clearly, like a word spoken too softly in an otherwise silent room. And that was when I began to understand how much of this had depended on me not paying attention, on me accepting explanations without asking for details, on me trusting that what was said matched what was done. And as I moved through the rest of the afternoon, preparing a simple dinner, listening to their conversations drift in and out of the kitchen, I started to piece together something else, something that had been there long before the money, long before they showed up at my door with their suitcases, because this was not the first time I had been left out of decisions that affected my own life. It was just the first time I had chosen to see it clearly, and I thought back to the past 2 years, to the way Daniel's calls had become shorter, more rushed, to how visits were always planned around their schedule, never mine, to the way Jessica would speak for him sometimes, answering questions that were not directed at her, guiding conversations in directions that felt controlled but never obviously so. And I realized that what I had dismissed as personality, as difference, as the natural distance that comes with adulthood, might have been something more deliberate, something that had slowly shifted my place in my own family without ever announcing itself. And sitting at the table that evening, watching them eat, listening to the soft clink of utensils and the low hum of conversation, I understood that the truth I had uncovered at the bank was only one part of a larger picture, one that I had been standing inside without recognizing. And now that I could see it, I knew I would not confront it all at once, because clarity does not require urgency. It requires patience. And if they had taken their time building this, then I could take mine understanding it, step by step, until there was nothing left that I did not see. The next morning, I did not rush anywhere. I did not make any calls that could be traced or leave any signs that I was about to change something. Instead, I followed my routine exactly as I had for years, making my coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light settle across the same kitchen table where I had spent so many mornings planning how to stretch what little I had. And as I sat there, I began to think not about what had been taken, but about what still remained within my control. Because the account at the bank had told me two things very clearly. First, that the money had existed, and second, that it had been moved with intention, and intention always leaves a trail, even when someone believes they have covered it well. So I went back to the folder I had brought home and looked at the details again, the dates of the transactions, the timing of the changes, the pattern of withdrawals that did not happen all at once, but in careful intervals, amounts that would not raise immediate suspicion. And I realized that whoever had done this had not acted in panic or desperation. They had acted with planning, with patience, which meant they believed they would never be questioned. And that belief, more than anything else, told me how they saw me, not as someone to deceive loudly, but as someone who would never look closely enough to notice. And I let that thought settle without reacting to it, because reacting would only serve them, not me. And as I heard movement upstairs, the quiet sound of Jessica walking across the floor, I closed the folder and placed it back where I had found it, returning everything to its place so nothing appeared disturbed. And when she came down a few minutes later, greeting me with the same polite tone she had used since arriving, I answered just as calmly, asking if she wanted coffee, watching the way she accepted it without hesitation, without suspicion, because as far as she knew, nothing had changed. And that was exactly how I needed it to remain for now. And throughout the day, I paid closer attention to the small things, the timing of their phone calls, the way Daniel stepped outside to take certain conversations, the way Jessica would lower her voice when discussing anything related to finances, and I began to understand that whatever arrangement they had created around that money, it was still active, still moving in ways I could not yet see, which meant there was still time to follow it, still time to understand the full extent of what had been done, and that understanding would matter far more than any immediate confrontation, because once something is revealed too soon, it disappears, it changes shape, it becomes harder to trace, and I was not interested in fragments. I wanted the whole picture, every decision, every step, every choice that had led to this moment. And later that afternoon, while Daniel was out and Jessica was distracted with a call, I quietly opened my laptop and began searching for something I had not thought about in years. The name of the attorney who had once helped Daniel set up his first business, a man I remembered as careful, precise, someone who valued structure and documentation. And it took longer than I expected, but eventually I found it, an old contact, still listed, still active, and I wrote down the number without calling it. Because this was not the time for questions that would alert anyone. This was the time for preparation. And as I closed the laptop, I felt that same clarity return, steady and quiet, guiding me forward. Because whatever had been built around me without my knowledge, I was now beginning to step outside of it, not by force, not by confrontation, but by understanding, and that, I knew, would be far more powerful in the end. The following day I made the call, not from my kitchen where voices could carry or footsteps could interrupt, but from my car parked 2 blocks away, where the only sound was the faint ticking of the engine cooling and my own breathing steadying into something calm and deliberate. And when the man on the other end answered, his voice older but still precise, I introduced myself carefully, not with urgency, not with accusation, just with enough detail to remind him who I was, Daniel's mother, someone he had met years ago when everything was still simple and transparent. And there was a pause before recognition settled in his tone, followed by a quiet willingness to listen, and I explained that I needed guidance, that there were financial matters connected to my name that I did not fully understand, and I chose my words with care, avoiding anything that sounded like conflict. Because I was not there to tell a story, I was there to uncover one. And as I described the account, the transfers, the changes I had been told about at the bank, I could hear the shift in his attention, the way he began to ask more specific questions, not out of curiosity, but out of professional instinct, dates, authorization types, who had access. And when I admitted that I had never personally approved any changes, there was a brief silence that carried more meaning than any direct statement could have, and he suggested that I come in to review the documentation together, not urgently, but soon, because matters like this, as he put it, were best understood in full before any action was taken, and I agreed, setting a time for later that week, choosing a day when Daniel would be out for most of the afternoon and Jessica would likely be occupied, because by now I understood that timing mattered just as much as truth, and when I returned home, nothing appeared different. The same quiet rooms, the same familiar sounds, Jessica in the living room, Daniel's jacket hanging by the door, but I felt different moving through it, not like a guest in my own life, but like someone who had stepped behind a curtain and could now see the mechanisms that had been hidden from view. And that evening at dinner, I listened more than I spoke, noting the ease in their voices, the confidence that came from believing everything was under control, and I realized that they were not worried about me at all, not because they did not care, but because they did not see me as someone who could change anything. And that realization did not hurt the way it might have before. Instead, it clarified something essential, because underestimation is not just an insult. It is an opening, and I intended to use it. And later that night, after they had both gone upstairs, I sat alone at the kitchen table again, the same place where this had begun to unravel, and I allowed myself to think through everything I knew so far, the account, the changes, the patterns, the silence between them when certain topics came up, and I understood that this was no longer just about money. It was about control, about who was allowed to know, who was expected to remain unaware, and who ultimately decided what role I played in my own life. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something firm settle into place inside me. Not anger, not even determination in the way people often describe it, but something quieter and more stable, a decision that whatever came next, I would not be reacting to their choices anymore. I would be making my own. 2 days later, I followed through with the appointment. Leaving the house at the same hour I usually went grocery shopping so nothing about my routine would seem unusual, and as I drove across town, I felt the same steady clarity that had been building inside me. Not rushed, not uncertain, just focused, because by now I understood that what I was uncovering would not reveal itself all at once. It would come in layers, each one requiring patience to fully see. And when I stepped into the office, the environment itself felt different from the bank, quieter, more deliberate, a place where details mattered and nothing was taken at face value. And the attorney greeted me with a calm professionalism that immediately set the tone, not emotional, not reactive, just attentive. And as we sat down, I laid out everything I had gathered so far, the account information, the transaction summaries, the timeline that had begun to form in my mind. And he listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking a precise question that guided me to clarify something I had not fully considered yet. And when I finished, he leaned back slightly and said something that settled heavily but clearly into the space between us, that the pattern I was describing was not accidental, that accounts opened under one name with access modified shortly after often indicated intentional redirection. And he explained that such changes, while processed through official channels, always left documentation behind, authorization records, digital signatures, verification, logs, all of which could be reviewed. And as he spoke, I realized that what had seemed like scattered pieces were actually part of a structure, something organized, something that could be traced if approached correctly. And he suggested that the next step would not be confrontation, but confirmation, requesting full access logs, identifying who had initiated each change, and when, and under what authority. And I agreed without hesitation, because this aligned exactly with what I had already begun to understand, that truth uncovered carefully is far more powerful than truth demanded too soon. And before I left, he added something else, something quieter but just as important, that in situations like this, the person who acts first without full information often loses control of the outcome. And as I walked out of that office, those words stayed with me, because control, I realized, was exactly what had been taken from me without my awareness, and exactly what I was now beginning to reclaim. And when I returned home later that afternoon, everything appeared as it always did. Daniel sitting at the table with his laptop open, Jessica on the couch scrolling through her phone, the normalcy of it almost precise in its consistency. But I saw it differently now, not as comfort, but as a surface, something maintained to keep deeper things hidden. And as I moved through the kitchen, setting down my keys, preparing dinner, answering their casual questions with equally casual responses, I paid close attention to the rhythm of their behavior, the way certain topics were avoided, the way others were introduced to fill space, and I understood that they believed time was on their side, that as long as nothing disrupted this pattern, nothing ever would. And that belief gave me something valuable, because it meant I could continue exactly as I had been, quiet, observant, unchanged on the outside, while everything beneath that surface was shifting in ways they could not yet see. And that night, as I sat alone again after they had gone upstairs, I no longer felt like I was trying to understand what had happened. I felt like I was beginning to see how it had been done, and more importantly, how it could be undone. The following morning, I received the first call back from the attorney's office. Not urgent, not alarming, just a quiet confirmation that the initial records had been requested, and that some preliminary details were already becoming clearer. And as I listened, standing by the kitchen window with the early light falling across the counter, I understood that what I had suspected was no longer just a possibility. It was beginning to take shape as something real and documented. Because the authorization trail showed that the changes to the account had not only been deliberate, they had been structured in a way that suggested familiarity with the system, with how to move access without triggering immediate concern. And when I asked who had initiated those changes, the answer was careful but direct, that the records pointed to a verified user acting under credentials that had been updated shortly after the account was opened. And although no name was stated outright at that moment, I did not need one, because there are certain patterns that, once seen, do not require confirmation to be understood. And after I ended the call, I remained still for a long moment, letting that information settle without reacting to it, because reaction, I reminded myself, would come later, after everything was fully in place. And as the day unfolded, I continued exactly as before, moving through the house with the same quiet routine, preparing meals, answering questions, listening more than speaking, while beneath that surface I began to make small, precise adjustments that no one would notice, organizing my documents in a way that made them easier to access, memorizing key dates and amounts so I would not need to refer to anything in front of them. And later that afternoon, when Daniel mentioned needing to handle some financial matters in the coming days, speaking casually, as if it were nothing out of the ordinary, I recognized the timing immediately, the subtle shift that indicated something was already in motion on their side as well. And that realization confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that whatever remained of that money, wherever it had been moved, it was still being managed, still active, which meant there was still an opportunity to intervene at the right moment, not by force, but by positioning. And that evening, as I sat at the table after they had gone upstairs, I reviewed everything again in my mind, not with emotion, but with clarity: the account, the transfers, the authorization trail, the careful behavior, the unspoken coordination between them. And I understood that the final step would not be uncovering more information. It would be choosing the exact moment to bring all of it into the open, a moment when it could not be dismissed, redirected, or explained away. And as I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the quiet of the room, I felt that same steady certainty guiding me, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer trying to understand what had been done. I was preparing to decide what would happen next. That evening I chose the moment carefully, not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because I understood that timing, more than anything, would determine whether the truth held its weight or slipped into something they could reshape. And as we sat down at the table, the same table where every quiet observation had begun to take form, I placed the folder beside me without drawing attention to it, letting the conversation move naturally at first, listening to Daniel talk about his day, to Jessica mention something about upcoming expenses, the ordinary rhythm they had grown comfortable in. And when there was a pause, a small, natural break in the conversation, I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly enough that both of them looked at me. And I said that I had visited the bank, and I watched the shift happen immediately, not dramatic, but precise, Daniel's posture stiffening slightly, Jessica's hand pausing mid-motion, and I continued before either of them could respond, explaining what I had learned, the account in my name, the transactions, the changes that had been made without my knowledge. And I did not accuse, I did not raise my voice. I simply stated what had been documented, what could be verified. And as I spoke, I opened the folder and placed a few pages on the table, turning them so they could see, not forcing them to look, just making it impossible not to. And for a moment there was silence, the kind that fills a room completely, leaving no space for deflection or distraction. And Daniel was the first to speak, his voice controlled but uncertain, asking what I meant, how I could be sure. And I answered him in the same calm tone, explaining that I had already consulted someone who understood these matters, that the authorization records had been requested, that the changes to the account were not assumptions but facts that would be fully documented. And I watched as the confidence that had once defined his expression began to shift into something else, something less certain, while Jessica remained very still, her silence now heavier than before, no longer casual, no longer dismissive. And I realized in that moment that the balance had already begun to change, not because I had confronted them, but because I had removed the one thing they had relied on, my unawareness. And I did not need to say more than that. I did not need to press or demand, because truth, when placed carefully, does not require force to take hold. It simply remains, waiting for others to respond to it. And as I gathered the papers back into the folder and stood up from the table, I left them with exactly what I had brought into that room: clarity, nothing more, nothing less. And as I walked away, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided in that moment. It would unfold in the space that followed, in the realization that what had once been hidden was no longer out of reach. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt no need to question where I stood, because I had already stepped into a position they had never expected me to take.